What would you do if the person you love most became a stranger across the table and the secret you carried could change everything? On a rainy afternoon in Portland, Grace Mitchell sat in a lawyer's office, staring at the divorce papers that would end her 5-year marriage. Across from her, Ethan Caldwell, once the man of her dreams, refused to meet her eyes. The silence was thick with everything they hadn't said: love, pride, regret. But in her purse, hidden beneath trembling hands, was a secret that could have rewritten their ending a pregnancy test with 2 pink lines. She walked away that day heartbroken, silent, and carrying a life he would never know existed. 6 years later, fate brought them face to face again. A mother who rebuilt her world, a father who didn't know he'd lost one, and a little girl with eyes that mirrored his own. Can love survive betrayal? Can forgiveness mend what pride once destroyed? And when life gives you a second chance, will you be brave enough to take it? If stories of love, loss, and redemption touch your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Now, let's begin. She signed the divorce papers, tore up the pregnancy test, and left crying. The rain hadn't stopped all morning. It drummed against the wide windows of the downtown Portland law office, a steady rhythm that filled the silence between 2 people who once swore they would never run out of things to say. Grace Mitchell sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the stack of divorce papers before her. The black ink bled slightly on the top sheet where she had already signed her initials. Her fingers trembled just enough that she pulled them back and pressed them together in her lap, trying to still the shaking. Across the polished walnut desk sat Ethan Caldwell, her husband, or rather, the man who had been her husband for 7 years. His dark gray suit looked too formal for a day like this, too immaculate, as if the right cut of cloth could make this moment feel less raw. His eyes, once the place she'd found warmth and laughter, were fixed now on a spot somewhere over her shoulder. Neither spoke. The only sound was the rain and the low ticking of the brass clock on the wall. Each tick felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Grace tried to find her voice, to say anything that could break the suffocating stillness, but her throat ached. She had rehearsed words last night, lines about forgiveness, about how maybe they could still fix what was broken. But those words had vanished now, replaced by the sound of rain and the memory of 1,000 arguments that had gone nowhere. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair. "We should get this done," he said at last. His voice was even, practiced. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't kind either. Grace nodded, her gaze falling to the pen resting near her right hand. It was a simple blue pen, the same kind she used to sign greeting cards and grocery lists. Funny, she thought, how ordinary an ending could look. She picked it up, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to whisper that she had taken a pregnancy test that morning, that the faint pink lines had appeared before dawn while she stood barefoot in their bathroom, one hand on the cool countertop to steady herself. She wanted to tell him that, after months of trying, after the fertility appointments and the tears, it had finally happened, but she didn't. Pride held her tongue, and fear pressed against her chest like a stone. Ethan hadn't looked at her, not really looked since the fight 3 nights ago, when he'd said she was holding him back, that his company needed him more than she did. Now he sat across from her, jaw tight, shoulders squared, already halfway out the door of their marriage. Grace lowered her eyes to the page. The rain outside grew heavier, blurring the city into streaks of gray. She wrote her full name, Grace Ann Mitchell Caldwell, in slow, deliberate strokes. Each letter felt like it took a piece of her with it. When she finished, she placed the pen down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the desk. Her hand brushed the corner of the paper, and for a moment, she almost pulled it back. But Ethan reached out, slid the document toward himself, and signed without hesitation. There it was, the final line between them, drawn in ink and silence. Grace stared at his signature, the bold sweep of his last name. Once, that name had made her feel safe. Now it felt like a brand she needed to scrub away. Is that all she asked quietly? Ethan glanced toward the attorney sitting near the door, a middle-aged man who looked uncomfortable to be in the same room. That should be everything, Ethan said. You'll get your copy in a few days. He stood. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He didn't look at her as he buttoned his jacket. Grace stayed seated, her palms pressed flat against her knees, fighting the urge to beg him to stop to look at her, to say something real, something human. But the words died in her throat, drowned by the weight of pride and exhaustion. He walked to the door. For a moment, his hand paused on the handle, as if he might turn back. Grace held her breath. But then he opened the door, and the sound of the rain filled the room like applause for something tragic. When the door closed behind him, the air felt thinner. Grace sat there for a long time. The lawyer cleared his throat gently and said he would mail her a copy of the finalized documents. She nodded without looking up. When she finally rose, her knees were weak. She gathered her coat and purse, her movements slow, as if her body didn't belong to her. The receptionist offered a polite, sympathetic smile as Grace passed through the lobby. She tried to return it, but couldn't. Outside, the rain met her face like 1,000 tiny needles. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and hurried down the steps. The city smelled of wet asphalt and coffee grounds. Halfway to her car, her chest tightened, and the tears she'd been holding back spilled free. She ducked into the shelter of a nearby alley, leaning against the cold brick wall, gasping for air she couldn't find. Through the blur of tears, she saw her reflection in a puddle, a woman she barely recognized. The same morning, she had imagined telling Ethan about the test, seeing his face light up, maybe even holding her for the first time in months. Instead, she stood alone, soaked and shivering, clutching her stomach as if to protect what no one else yet knew. For a long time, she stayed there, letting the rain wash over her. When she finally straightened, her tears had stopped, but something inside her had gone very quiet. She walked to her car, started the engine, and drove away through the gray streets of Portland, leaving behind the life she had built and the man she still, painfully, loved behind her. The rain kept falling, indifferent and endless. The restroom was cold and too bright. Fluorescent lights hummed above Grace's head, their sharp white glare bouncing off the tiled walls. She locked the stall door behind her and pressed her back against it, breathing hard. Her hands shook as she dug into her purse. Somewhere beneath her keys, wallet, and tissues lay the small test wrapped in a crumpled paper towel. She found it by touch, the faintest weight, but heavier than anything she had ever held. For a moment, she just stood there, the sound of the rain outside muffled by thick glass and the echo of distant traffic. The office building was quiet now. Most people had gone to lunch. Only her own heartbeat filled the space between her ears. She unwrapped the paper towel slowly, as if opening a secret she wasn't ready to face. 2 pink lines, clear, undeniable. Her vision blurred. She bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh, God." Grace pressed the test to her chest as though it might disappear if she held it tightly enough. But it didn't. It stayed there, warm against her palm, pulsing with a truth that would change everything. She thought of Ethan, his face that morning, expression carved from stone, his signature scrawled across the divorce papers like a final verdict. He hadn't looked at her, not once. Now, here she was, standing in a restroom stall with a miracle in her hand and no one to share it with. Her mind began to spin. What would she do? How could she possibly raise a child alone? She had savings, some freelance work lined up, but not enough. Her family lived states away. And Ethan? Ethan was already gone. She sank onto the closed toilet lid, burying her face in her hands. The sobs came quietly at first, then harder, shaking her shoulders until she could hardly breathe. She had dreamed of this moment for years. There had been countless nights when she and Ethan talked about baby names, nursery colors, what kind of parents they might be. Back then, it felt like love could carry them through anything. But love had thinned out, replaced by deadlines, missed dinners, and the hollow sound of his office door closing behind him. Now, when she finally carried the proof of what they once prayed for, it was too late. Grace looked at the test again. The 2 lines were faint but firm, small strokes of pink against white plastic, quietly announcing a new heartbeat inside her. A part of her wanted to run after him to burst into the hallway, hold out the test, and say, "Ethan, look, you're going to be a father." Maybe he would soften. Maybe he'd remember what they once meant to each other. But another voice, quieter, steadier, spoke from somewhere deep inside. "He won't hear you. Grace, not now, not like this." That voice was right. The Ethan she had loved would have held her, whispered comfort. The Ethan who left that office today was a man consumed by pride, by the need to win at everything, even love. Grace stood and went to the small sink outside the stall. She stared at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed older than 32 eyes, red-rimmed, cheeks pale, hair plastered to her face with rain and tears. "You can do this," she murmured, though she didn't quite believe it. "You've always done the hard things." Her reflection said nothing. The test still lay in her palm. 2 tiny lines. 2 impossible promises. Grace turned it over, then back again, as if a different angle might tell her what to do. But it was just plastic and ink, holding both hope and heartbreak. She thought about what keeping it might mean, how, every time she saw it, she would remember this moment, the end of her marriage and the beginning of a life she hadn't planned. And then she thought about what letting it go would mean. Her fingers tightened. She felt the edges bend slightly beneath her grip. "Maybe it's better this way," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's just mine to carry." With a slow breath, Grace tore the test in 2. The sound was small, like a page being turned. She dropped the pieces into the trash, where they landed softly on a layer of paper towels and discarded tissues. For a long time, she stared down into the bin. The pink lines were still visible, even into fragments, 2 faint streaks that refused to disappear. Tears blurred her vision again. She pressed her hands against the cool porcelain of the sink, trying to steady herself. "This isn't the end," she told herself aloud, as if the words could build a wall against the despair creeping in. "It's just something different." Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to breathe. She washed her face, letting the cold water shock her back into focus. Her skin tingled, her eyes burned, but her heart began to settle into a kind of quiet acceptance. Grace dried her face with a rough paper towel, smoothed her hair, and adjusted her coat. When she reached for her purse again, her fingers hesitated for just a second near the pocket where the test had been. Empty now, the weight of that emptiness settled inside her like a stone. She unlocked the restroom door and stepped back into the hallway. The world looked exactly the same flickering light, same gray rain pressing against the glass, but she knew nothing was the same anymore. Every step she took toward the elevator felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted her. By the time she reached the street, her tears had dried. The city moved around her, people under umbrellas, buses hissing through puddles, a man in a suit checking his watch. No one noticed her. Grace pulled her coat tighter and whispered under her breath, "It's just us now." The words were barely audible, lost in the hum of the rain, but they felt real. As she walked toward her car, she pressed a hand over her stomach, not out of fear anymore, but in a fragile gesture of protection. She didn't have answers. She didn't have a plan, but she had something, someone worth surviving for. The apartment smelled like cardboard and rain. Grace Mitchell stood in the doorway, a roll of packing tape in her hand, staring at the life she'd built stacked in uneven towers across the living room. Boxes labeled in black marker books. Kitchen, art supplies, winter coats. She'd always prided herself on neatness, but endings were messy. There was no graceful way to pack a marriage. She started with the bookcase. Paperback slid into a box with the soft sound of surrender. A novel she'd underlined in bright ink during better years. A dog-eared cookbook spattered with olive oil and laughter. a photography collection they'd bought from a sidewalk vendor the summer they thought they needed nothing but each other. Grace paused, a half-smile tugging at her mouth, then let it fall. She lowered the lid and pressed the tape across the seam. In the bedroom, she opened the closet and stopped. Ethan's empty hangers swung gently, as if the space still remembered the weight of his suits. She pushed them to one side and pulled down a shoebox from the top shelf. Inside lay old greeting cards, a strip of photo booth images, the first love note scribbled on a coffee receipt. She touched the thin paper. Her fingers hesitated, then she set the box on the bed. "Keep it or toss it," she asked herself under her breath. The answer didn't come. Not yet. The doorbell rang. Grace wiped her palms on her jeans, crossed the living room, and opened the door to Maggie O'Connor, freckled, red-haired, a wool beanie pulled low over her ears. Maggie stepped in with a gust of wet air and the smell of coffee. "I brought fuel," Maggie said, lifting 2 paper cups, and muffins, blueberry, the kind you pretend not to like because you say they're too sweet. Grace almost laughed. "I say that because they are. And yet you eat them," Maggie replied with a look that said, "Let me soften today wherever I can." They stood a moment, eyes meeting in the familiar way of women who had carried one another through storms. Maggie's expression flickered to the boxes, then back to Grace's face. She saw the dark circles under Grace's eyes, the set of her mouth. She didn't ask for details. She didn't have to. "Okay," Maggie said, rolling up her sleeves. "Where do we start?" "The kitchen," Grace answered. "It feels least haunted." They worked in companionable quiet, broken by small sounds, the clink of dishes wrapped in newspaper, tape tearing, the thud of a closed box set aside. Maggie told a story about a first grader in her class who insisted on wearing a superhero cape to math tests. Grace listened, grateful for the bright thread in the gray day. When they paused, Maggie took in the apartment, the blank walls where prints had hung, the pale rectangles of sun-faded paint like ghosts of afternoons gone. "You've been here a long time," she said gently. 7 years, Grace replied. "Almost all of our married life." Maggie sipped her coffee. "Do you want to talk about it?" Grace shook her head. Words felt heavy and insufficient. 1,000 sentences pressed behind her ribs. But none would make this simpler. She picked up a bubble-wrapped vase and eased it into a box. "Okay," Maggie said softly. "Then I'll just be here." They finished the kitchen and moved to the bedroom. Maggie spotted the shoebox on the bed and raised an eyebrow. The memories, Grace nodded. "I don't know what to do with them." Maggie sat, patting the mattress. "You don't have to decide today." Grace opened the shoebox anyway. The photo booth strip smiled up at her 2 faces framed by cheap curtains. Back when everything felt possible, her hair loose around her shoulders. Ethan's arm hooked around her neck, both of them laughing so hard they looked foolish and free. Her chest tightened. She set the strip aside, picked up the coffee receipt with Ethan's cramped handwriting. "You, me, always." She folded it once, then again, and tucked it into her wallet. Some things could be archived without being on display. They packed in steady rhythm until the afternoon light turned pewter and city traffic began to hum below. From the window, raindrops chased one another down the glass, splitting, rejoining, swallowed by the sill. Portland looked both familiar and far away, like a hometown glimpsed from a moving train. "You don't have to stay here," Maggie said, following Grace's gaze. "Ashbrook's quiet. There's a little craftsman on Maple Street that opens to a yard with a crooked apple tree. I passed the rental sign on my way to school yesterday." She smiled. "You could set up your drawing table by a window. Fresh air, no sirens at 2 a.m. Grace held her coffee cup with both hands, letting the heat steady her. "Leaving feels like admitting defeat. Leaving can be choosing peace," Maggie said. "It's not running away. It's walking towards something. There's a difference." Grace turned that over carefully. Walking toward. The words made something inside her loosen. Just a notch. Maggie studied her friend's face. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I can see there's more than heartbreak in your eyes." She paused. voice softening. Are you okay? Grace's hand drifted, unconsciously, to her abdomen. The smallest motion, barely there. I will be, she said, and for the first time all day, she believed it. They loaded boxes into Maggie's SUV, the cardboard edges biting cold into their fingers. The rain had thinned to a mist that beaded on their coats and eyelashes. When they came back upstairs for the last load, the apartment looked strangely large, emptied of chairs and pictures. It was just square footage and echoes. Grace stood in the center of the living room and turned slowly, mapping the invisible layers that remained. Here, the corner where the Christmas tree always leaned a little to the left. There, the dent in the wall from a botched attempt to hang a plant. The kitchen doorway where she and Ethan used to kiss while pasta water boiled. She felt the ache of it, a tenderness more than a wound. Maggie came to stand beside her. Say what you need to say, she murmured. Grace cleared her throat, surprised by her own voice. Thank you, she said to the empty room. For shelter, for good mornings, for the lessons I didn't want but probably needed. A soft peace spread through her chest, stitched with sadness. She nodded once, decisive. Let's go. Downstairs. They tied the last box in the trunk with a bungee cord and climbed into the SUV. Maggie adjusted the heat, handing Grace a napkin for her damp hands. The wipers set a metronome across the windshield. As they pulled away from the curb, Grace looked up at the windows one last time. She imagined the rooms holding their breath, then exhaling as the building settled back into its own life. The city blurred a quilt of brick and glass, coffee shops, bike lanes, murals, bridges arcing like ribs over the Willamette. At the on-ramp, Maggie checked her mirrors. Ashbrook, she asked. Grace hesitated just a heartbeat, just enough to feel the weight of her choice. Then she nodded. Ashbrook. They merged into traffic. The city receded, exit signs ticking past like verse numbers in a hymn. Grace rested a hand on her belly again. Not as a question this time, but as a promise. She didn't yet know how she would do it. The practicalities lined up like unsolved math rent, prenatal care, work deadlines, the long nights. But the decision to leave had shifted the air around her. It smelled less like rain, more like clean earth after a storm. Maggie glanced over. We'll make lists, she said, as if reading Grace's mind. Doctor's appointments, budget, groceries. I'll be there for the early mornings and the late ones. You won't be alone. Grace swallowed, her throat tight. Thank you. For what friends are for, Maggie replied. Besides, I always wanted to live somewhere with an apple tree to steal from. They laughed quiet, half-broken, real, past the city limits. The highway narrowed to 2 lanes, fir trees crowding close, their needles shining. Grace leaned her head back and closed her eyes, letting the gentle rise and fall of the road lull her. A hush spread inside her, tender and resolute. She was leaving Portland with a heart full of cracks, a trunk full of boxes, and a secret small as a seed and just as alive. Not running away, walking toward. The rain eased to a fine silver mist, and the sky ahead, over the dark line of trees, held a seam of light. Ashbrook was smaller than Grace had imagined. A single main street cut through the town, lined with maple trees and brick storefronts that looked as if they'd been there forever. An old diner with a squeaky neon sign. A post office the size of her former kitchen. A hardware store with a faded awning. It wasn't glamorous, but something about it felt steady, grounded. The kind of place where time moved differently. The rental house Maggie had found sat on the edge of town, tucked behind a row of cedar trees that smelled faintly of rain and pine. It was old, a pale blue craftsman with chipped paint, crooked shutters, and a porch that groaned under the weight of history. The rent was low, which meant the plumbing might rattle and the heater might groan. But Grace didn't mind. She wanted imperfect things now. They felt honest. When she stepped inside for the first time, the air was cool and musty, like pages in an old book. Dust motes drifted through the light that spilled across the floorboards. The rooms were small but connected in a way that felt intimate. From the front door, She could see all the way through to the kitchen and the small window that looked out into the backyard. Beyond that window, a single apple tree stood crooked in the center of the yard, its bark rough, its branches bare except for a few stubborn leaves clinging to the ends. Grace smiled softly. Maggie had mentioned the tree. "It's a survivor," she'd said, "like you." Grace spent her first evening there, unpacking the essentials coffee mugs, blankets, her drawing tablet, and the framed sketch she'd done years ago of the Portland skyline. She placed it on a shelf and hesitated. It didn't belong here, not really, but it was a reminder of who she had been, of the life that had shaped her courage to start again. The next morning, the light came early. Grace woke to the sound of birds instead of traffic, a silence so deep it startled her. For a few seconds, she didn't remember where she was. Then the smell of cedar and the creak of the old floorboards brought it all rushing back. She sat up slowly, one hand instinctively moving to her stomach. 6 weeks, maybe 7. She hadn't called a doctor yet. The thought alone filled her with both wonder and dread. There were practical things to consider: insurance, prenatal care, what to tell Maggie, whether to tell anyone else at all, but none of that fit neatly inside her heart yet. The secret was too new, too fragile to name. Grace shuffled into the kitchen, made coffee, and sat at the small table near the window. The apple tree swayed gently in the breeze. Beneath it, patches of damp earth glistened from last night's rain. She thought about how, come spring, the branches would bloom again slowly, quietly, without anyone needing to tell them how. She wrapped her hands around the mug and let the warmth settle into her fingers. Outside, the mail truck rolled by. A woman in a red coat walked her dog. A boy on a bicycle waved as he passed. Ashbrook was the kind of town where people noticed each other, even strangers. It made Grace feel both comforted and exposed. That afternoon, she set up her work table near the front window where the light was best. Her old laptop, sketch pads, watercolors, and pencils spread across the surface in organized chaos. She sent a few emails to publishers she'd freelanced for in the past, mentioning that she was open for commissions again. Within hours, one replied, an independent press out of Seattle needing a children's book cover. It wasn't much money, but it was a start. When the email came through, Grace felt a small spark of relief, a reminder that she could still build something on her own. She printed the manuscript, pinned concept sketches to the wall, and spent the evening sketching while an old record played softly in the background. The sound of the needle crackling between songs filled the quiet house, weaving a thread of nostalgia through the stillness. But beneath her focus, nausea churned like a tide. Around 8, she dropped her pencil, pushed back from the table, and hurried to the bathroom. She knelt over the sink, breathing through waves of sickness that left her dizzy. When it passed, she sank onto the cool tile floor, one hand on her chest, the other over her abdomen. "Okay," she whispered, half laughing, half crying. "We're really doing this." It felt strange, talking to something or someone so tiny she couldn't yet feel it move. But it made the loneliness smaller. It made the silence bearable. Later, as the evening shadows stretched across the floor, she curled up on the couch with a blanket and her sketchbook. She tried to draw the apple tree outside, but the lines kept blurring. Her mind wandered to Ethan, to the way he used to rest his hand on her back when they crossed a street, to the small kindnesses that had faded long before love did. She wondered if he was sitting in his glass-walled office right now, glancing at his phone, feeling even a flicker of what she felt. Probably not. He had always known how to bury his feelings beneath ambition, but the thought still hurt. Grace closed her sketchbook and stared out the window. The apple tree was barely visible now, its branches dark against the fading light. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked, and the faint hum of a passing train drifted through the cool air. She thought about the baby growing quietly inside her, about the future that stretched out like a road she hadn't planned to walk. It scared her, terrified her. Really, but fear wasn't the only thing she felt. There was also something gentler, steadier. Faith, maybe, or just the stubborn refusal to give up. She whispered into the dimness, "We'll be okay." The words lingered in the air, simple and unsteady, but real. In the weeks that followed, Grace settled into a rhythm. She learned which windows let in the morning sun and which ones leaked when it rained. She walked to the small grocery store 2 blocks away, where the cashier already knew her name by the third visit. She painted late into the night, sending sketches to publishers, and sometimes, when the nausea came, she sat on the porch steps breathing slowly until it passed. Every day, the apple tree outside her kitchen window stood as a quiet companion, bare branches against gray skies, patient and alive. Grace found herself talking to it sometimes, as if the tree might understand. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" she would say softly. "You just keep growing anyway." One evening, a letter arrived from Maggie, handwritten, the envelope smudged by rain. Inside was a short note. "Remember, new soil makes old roots stronger. I believe in you." Grace read it twice, tears pooling in her eyes. She taped the note to the refrigerator and smiled. By the time winter melted into spring, small green buds appeared on the apple tree. They looked fragile at first, uncertain, but with each passing day, they opened wider, stretching toward the sun. Grace watched from the window, one hand resting gently over her growing belly, and thought maybe that's all any of them could do. Keep reaching, keep growing, even through the fear. The air inside the Ashbrook Community Hospital was thick with the scent of antiseptic and rain-soaked earth. Outside, a spring storm rumbled softly against the windows, thunder rolling like a heartbeat in the distance. The nurses moved quietly through the dim corridor, their sneakers whispering across the floor, their voices calm and steady, as if this moment were sacred and fragile all at once. Grace Mitchell clutched the sides of the hospital bed, her breath shallow and uneven. Her hair clung to her temples in damp strands, her face pale but determined. The contraction passed, and she let out a long, shaky exhale. Maggie O'Connor sat beside her, one hand wrapped firmly around Grace's, the other brushing a cool cloth across her forehead. "You're doing great, sweetheart," Maggie said, her voice low and sure, the voice of someone who had spent her life comforting frightened children. "You're almost there. Just keep breathing." Grace nodded, her lips trembling into something like a smile. "Almost there," she whispered back, though time had lost meaning hours ago. Labor had blurred into a haze of pain and waiting, of whispered encouragements and muffled cries. Between contractions, she drifted in and out of memory flashes of her small blue house, the apple tree swaying in sunlight, the first tiny kick inside her belly. And then, inevitably, Ethan. His name floated through her mind like a prayer she no longer said out loud. She had pictured him here once, imagined the warmth of his hand in hers, the look of wonder on his face when he saw their child for the first time. But that was before the silence, before the signatures that ended everything. Now, his absence pressed around her like an invisible wall. Still, when the next wave of pain hit, she found herself whispering his name under her breath. It came out broken, a sound half prayer, half release. The doctor entered, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind square glasses. "All right, Grace," she said gently. "It's time to push. You're ready." Maggie tightened her grip. "You've got this," she said. "Look at me. Just one step at a time." Grace focused on Maggie's face, on the freckles that danced across her cheeks, on the steady blue of her eyes. She bore down through the pain, her breath catching, the world narrowing to a single point of effort and light. She heard herself cry out, felt Maggie's hand squeezing hers, felt the doctor's calm, encouraging words somewhere beyond the fog of her own heartbeat. And then a sound, a sharp, clear cry. The world stilled. Grace collapsed back against the pillows, her whole body trembling, tears spilling freely before she even understood why. She heard the rustle of fabric, the gentle murmur of the nurse, the soft thump of tiny feet being wiped clean. Then, suddenly, there was warmth, the weight of a new life placed carefully against her chest. For a moment, Grace couldn't move. She could only stare. The baby was small, wrapped in a white blanket, her skin pink and new. Her eyes fluttered open, and Grace gasped softly. They were blue, not the pale, uncertain blue of newborns, but deep and unmistakable. Ethan's blue. Grace's breath caught, her heart breaking and healing all at once. "Hi there," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Hi, little one." The baby blinked slowly, as if listening. "She's perfect," Maggie said beside her, tears shining on her cheeks. "Absolutely perfect." Grace smiled through her own tears. "Her name's Lily," she said softly. "Lily Mae Mitchell?" Maggie's face lit up. "Lily," she repeated. "That's beautiful." Grace nodded, brushing her finger along her daughter's tiny cheek. "It was my grandmother's name. She used to say Lily's bloom even after the hardest winters." The baby stirred, a soft whimper escaping her lips, and Grace instinctively held her closer. "Shh," she murmured, rocking gently. "You're safe, sweetheart. You're safe." The doctor smiled, making notes on a chart. "She's strong," she said, "and healthy. You did wonderfully, Grace." When they left the room, the world felt suspended, just the steady rhythm of the rain and the quiet breaths of mother and child. Maggie sat in the corner chair, sipping cold coffee, her eyes never leaving them. "You're really a mom now," Maggie said softly. Grace laughed weakly. "That's terrifying." Maggie chuckled. "You'll figure it out. You've already done the hardest part." Grace looked down at Lily again, tracing the soft curve of her daughter's ear, the tiny swirl of hair on her head. The fragility of her made Grace ache. Every inhale, every blink felt like a miracle she was afraid to touch. And beneath the wonder, there was fear, sharp and sudden. What if I can't do this? What if she deserves more than me? She pushed the thought away and replaced it with another Ethan's eyes. Those same blue eyes that now stared up at her from a face barely the size of her palm. For the first time since she'd left Portland, Grace allowed herself to imagine what it would have been like if he had been here, if he had held their daughter, if he had whispered her name with awe instead of silence. But imagining only hurt, and Grace had promised herself no more pain today. So, she focused on the rhythm of Lily's breathing, the soft warmth of her skin, the way her tiny fingers curled instinctively around Grace's own. Hours passed quietly. The rain softened into a mist. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, offering water and reassurance. The world beyond the hospital walls faded, leaving only this small room where love and exhaustion intertwined. By evening, the sky outside had deepened into shades of violet and gold. Grace sat propped up in bed, Lily asleep in her arms, her head nestled under Grace's chin. Maggie stood by the window, the soft glow of a streetlight outlining her silhouette. "You should rest," Maggie said gently. "I can't stop looking at her," Grace whispered. "She's everything." Maggie smiled. "You deserve this. Grace, after everything, you deserve her." Grace didn't answer. She just nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She pressed a kiss to the top of Lily's head, inhaling the faint, sweet scent of new life. "She's a miracle," she murmured. "Yeah," Maggie said softly, "and so are you." Outside, the rain finally stopped. The world was still, in the quiet. Grace closed her eyes and listened to the soft, steady heartbeat against her chest, the sound of her daughter, her future, her reason to keep going. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Grace let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, everything broken could someday be whole again. 5 years passed like pages turning in a book quietly, steadily, marked by fingerprints of ordinary days. In Ashbrook, the seasons came and went in soft repetition, winters of mist and firewood smoke, springs that smelled of rain and apple blossoms, summers filled with the hum of bees and laughter drifting from backyards. Grace Mitchell built her life slowly, like someone stitching a quilt from the scraps of what remained. Each morning began the same way. She woke before dawn, when the house was still wrapped in silence. The old floorboards creaked as she padded to the kitchen, wrapped in a sweater too big for her shoulders. She brewed coffee, the smell rich and grounding, and stood by the window, watching the fog lift from the apple tree. The branches, once bare and brittle, now stretched wide and leafy, heavy with small green fruit that glistened in the early light. Then came the sound that made every day worth it, tiny feet thumping across the hallway, the squeak of a bedroom door. Mommy Grace turned, smiling before she even saw her. Lily, now 5, stood in the doorway in mismatched pajamas, unicorns on top, polka dots on the bottom, her blonde hair a sleepy halo. She rubbed her eyes and held out her arms. "There's my sunshine," Grace said softly, kneeling to scoop her up, Lily's arms wrapped around her neck, warm and trusting. "You smell like coffee, and you smell like dreams," Grace teased, kissing her cheek, ready for pancakes. It was their ritual. Sunday pancakes shaped like animals, weekdays quick cereal or toast, Saturday adventures to the farmer's market downtown. Their life wasn't glamorous, but it was full of small joys that made the air feel lighter. After breakfast, Grace packed Lily's lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, and a small note folded into a paper heart that always said the same thing: "You are loved, my brave girl." By 8 o'clock, they were out the door. The walk to school took 7 minutes if Lily didn't stop to pick dandelions. Usually, she did. The little path wound past picket fences and mailboxes painted in cheerful colors. Everyone in town knew Lily. She waved at each neighbor as though she were greeting royalty. At the school gate, Grace always crouched down to Lily's level. "Be kind, be curious, and be brave." Lily would finish with a grin. "Just like you." Watching her daughter run toward the classroom never stopped tugging at Grace's heart. There was something in Lily's laughter, a wild, free sound that made Grace feel both proud and afraid. When she returned home, the house seemed too quiet at first. Grace filled the silence with music, old jazz records or soft acoustic songs, and went to work at her desk by the window. Her freelance design business had grown over the years, enough to keep the bills paid and the pantry stocked. Publishers from Seattle and Portland sent her manuscripts. Authors asked for her covers by name. Sometimes she still doubted herself, but when she saw her illustrations printed on glossy jackets in the bookstore, it felt like proof that she could build beauty from the ruins. Outside the window, the apple tree was her constant muse. She had painted it dozens of times in snow, in blossom, in sunset light, each version reflecting the quiet evolution of her own life. Around noon, she'd take a break to hang laundry or walk to the cafe on Main Street for a cup of tea. The barista, a cheerful widow named Helen, always asked about Lily, and Grace always answered the same way: she's growing too fast. Sometimes people asked about Lily's father. Small towns noticed things: the absence of a ring, the quiet way Grace deflected certain questions. "Her dad must be proud," someone would say casually. Grace would smile, sip her coffee, and answer, "He lives far away." The lie came easily now, worn smooth by repetition. It wasn't cruel, just protective, a barrier between her daughter and a truth that still felt too heavy to unpack. At home, evenings were their favorite time. Grace cooked while Lily sat at the kitchen table drawing. Crayons rolled across the surface, leaving small streaks of color. "Look," Mommy Lily would announce, "it's you and me under the apple tree. And that's our house. And that's Mr. Bumbles. Mr. Bumbles was the neighbor's orange cat who had unofficially adopted them. Grace looked at the picture, 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands, and her throat tightened every time. "It's perfect," she'd say. "You're quite the artist. I want to draw books like you someday," Lily said one evening, swinging her feet. Grace smiled. "Then you will." After dinner, they curled up on the couch with picture books or watched the fireflies blink outside the window. On the nights when storms rolled through and thunder shook the walls, Lily would crawl into Grace's bed, whispering, "Can I sleep with you tonight?" "Always," Grace would answer, wrapping her arms around her daughter as rain tapped softly on the roof. Those were the simple years, the healing years. Grace still had moments of doubt, times when she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and saw the woman who had once sat in a Portland law office, breaking apart quietly. But those moments faded quickly now. She had rebuilt herself, one small kindness at a time. On the anniversary of Lily's birth each spring, Maggie came to visit. She always brought a homemade pie and laughter that filled the small house. The three of them would sit on the porch beneath the blooming apple tree, watching petals fall like slow snow. "Can you believe she's 5?" Maggie would say, shaking her head. "Barely," Grace would answer, her eyes soft. I blinked, and she grew wings, sometimes after Lily fell asleep. Grace and Maggie sat together in the quiet living room, sipping tea. Maggie never pressed for details about Ethan anymore, though his name lingered unspoken between them. Grace suspected Maggie knew there were still unanswered questions, but some stories were better left folded, tucked away like fragile letters in a drawer. At night, when the house finally stilled and the moonlight spilled across the floor, Grace often found herself standing by Lily's bed. She watched the gentle rise and fall of her daughter's chest, the way her small hand curled around her blanket, the same peaceful expression she'd had the day she was born. Every night, Grace whispered the same promise: "You'll always be loved, no matter what." And though the years had taught her that love could break, twist, and scatter, she also knew it could take root again quietly, stubbornly in the most unexpected places. Outside, the apple tree rustled in the night breeze, its branches heavy with fruit. Grace glanced toward it and smiled faintly. Life was still imperfect: the bills, the long hours, the quiet ache of what was missing, but it was hers. And for the first time, she no longer measured her days by what she had lost, but by everything she had found. The skyline of Portland shimmered against the night glass towers reflecting the river, bridges strung with golden lights like necklaces. From the penthouse suite on the 37th floor of the Caldwell Innovations headquarters, the view was breathtaking. It was also, to Ethan Caldwell, unbearably hollow. He stood before the wide window, a tumbler of bourbon in his hand. The city sprawled beneath him like something he had conquered. Years ago, he had dreamed of this, of owning the view, of being the man whose name meant power, progress, success. And now, he was that man. At 39, Ethan was a story the business magazines loved to tell. A boy from a small Oregon town who had built a multi-million-dollar tech empire, who spoke at conferences about innovation and discipline, whose company's apps had changed the way cities managed everything from traffic lights to energy grids. He was the face of ambition realized: tailored suits, private jets, silent investors, and headlines that praised him for his relentless vision. Relentless. That word had followed him everywhere. It had been his armor, his identity. But tonight, it just sounded like exhaustion. Behind him, the penthouse was immaculate minimalist furniture, gleaming marble counters, curated art that someone else had chosen. Everything was in its place. Everything except peace. The digital clock on the counter blinked 10:42 p.m. Ethan loosened his tie, the silk brushing against his collarbone. He hadn't eaten dinner. He rarely did anymore. The long hours and boardroom politics left little room for appetite. His assistant, a well-meaning man named Robert Hayes, had reminded him to take the weekend off. Ethan had nodded and then booked 2 more meetings. Now, the silence pressed in. He crossed to his desk, a sleek slab of walnut and glass overlooking the city, and opened his laptop. Dozens of unread emails filled the screen. Investor reports, acquisition proposals, meeting requests. His empire was thriving, yet his chest felt tight, as though something essential had slipped through his fingers without him noticing. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. On the coffee table lay a copy of Forbes. His own face stared back at him from the cover: Ethan Caldwell, the relentless visionary behind the future of smart cities. He turned it over, letting it fall with a soft thud. Underneath it, half hidden by paperwork, was an older magazine time from 5 years earlier. The headline read, "The New Titans of Tech." He remembered that photo shoot vividly. Grace had still been in his life then, though barely. She had stood in the doorway that morning, her hair loose, her expression tired but hopeful. She had asked him if he could come home early for dinner that night. He had kissed her cheek and said he'd try. He hadn't. The photo from that day captured him smiling, confident, a man with everything to gain. But looking at it now, he could see what the camera hadn't: the faint shadow under his eyes, the hollowness behind the smile. Ethan poured another inch of bourbon, the ice clinking softly. He carried the glass back to the window and stared out again at the city's reflection. It was beautiful, but distant, a world made of glass and light, untouched by warmth. He wondered when success had started to feel so sterile. Earlier that week, one of his junior executives had given a presentation on work-life balance, quoting a study about happiness and longevity. The room had laughed politely, everyone pretending the word happiness meant something measurable. Ethan had laughed too, but the sound had caught in his throat. That night, he'd gone home and typed "how to be happy" into a search bar like a lost man looking for a map. He remembered staring at the search results, endless lists about gratitude, relationships, self-care. He'd closed the browser, ashamed of the question. Now, as the rain began to streak the windows, Ethan set his glass down and walked to the small shelf by his desk. It was the only personal corner in the apartment, holding a few framed photographs and a faded sketch Grace had once drawn. She'd called it "Home in the Rain." He picked it up carefully. The paper had yellowed at the edges. The sketch showed a small house under an umbrella of storm clouds, light glowing from its windows. Beneath it, in her neat handwriting, she had written, "For you a reminder that shelter isn't a building, it's a heart that stays open." He swallowed hard. He couldn't remember when she had given it to him, maybe their 3rd anniversary. He had brushed it off back then, too consumed with quarterly projections to think about metaphors. Now, standing alone in his penthouse, he realized it was the only real thing he owned. He traced a finger along the ink lines. For years, he had convinced himself that Grace was too emotional, too sensitive, too needy, that her longing for closeness distracted him from purpose. But purpose without love had turned out to be a desert vast, impressive, and utterly unlivable. He carried the frame to the window, holding it against the glass. Outside, the city lights blurred through the rain. He saw his own reflection superimposed over hers, her drawing glowing faintly against the skyline he had once chased for her. A sudden ache spread through his chest, sharp and unexpected. He hadn't thought of her in weeks, maybe months. At least that's what he'd told himself. But memory was a stubborn tide. He could still hear her laugh echoing in their old kitchen, the sound of her humming while she worked late at her drafting table, the way she'd press her palm to his back when he leaned over his laptop too long. Small things invisible in the moment, irreplaceable after. He had built an empire, yes, but somewhere along the way, he had burned the bridge that led home. The phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him back. A message from Robert Hayes' reminder board: meeting Monday, investor dinner, Tuesday, red-eye to New York, Wednesday. Ethan stared at the screen, then locked it. He left the phone face down. He returned to the window one more time. The rain had eased, leaving faint trails down the glass like tears he would never admit to. In the distance, the Willamette River glowed silver under the bridge lights. For a fleeting moment, he wondered where Grace was. Did she still live in Oregon? Did she ever think of him when it rained? He imagined her in some quiet town painting, maybe, or teaching art classes. Her hair pulled back, her smile gentle. He tried to picture her happy. It was easier to imagine her that way than to face what he'd done. Ethan took a slow breath and whispered into the empty room, "I hope you're safe." His voice sounded foreign, like a confession meant for no one. When the elevator doors closed behind him later that night, the penthouse was left in perfect silence, lights dimmed, glass walls reflecting nothing but the city's distant glow. He didn't know yet that 5 years of regret would soon meet 5 years of grace. For now. All he had was the empire he'd built and the echo of what it had cost him. The afternoon sun slanted low across the city as Ethan Caldwell's car moved steadily along the highway, the hum of tires on asphalt a quiet background to his thoughts. He sat in the back seat, scrolling through emails on his tablet while his driver, Mark, navigated the mid-afternoon traffic. They were heading to Salem for a last-minute investor meeting, one more item in a life filled with meetings that all felt the same. "Take the next left," Ethan said absently, not looking up. "Yes, sir," Mark replied. But a few turns later, the skyline began to dissolve into winding roads and clusters of trees. The sleek office buildings gave way to neighborhoods, then to open stretches of countryside. Ethan frowned. "Where are we?" Mark slowed slightly, squinting at the GPS. "I think I missed the highway split, sir. We're near Ashbrook. Just a few miles off course. I'll get us back on track." "Ashbrook," Ethan repeated under his breath. The name stirred something faint in his memory. A postcard his assistant once sent from here. A quiet town tucked near the foothills, known for its farmers' market and antique fairs. He leaned back against the seat, impatient but oddly reluctant to rush. Outside, the late spring light painted everything gold. Kids on bicycles sped along the sidewalks. A woman with a basket of groceries waved at a passing car. The town looked like a painting, the kind of place that existed beyond the noise of ambition. Mark slowed as traffic gathered near a small intersection. A yellow school bus had just pulled to the curb, releasing a flurry of children. Their laughter filled the air, bright and unguarded. Ethan glanced up from his tablet and froze. Through the car window, across the street, stood a woman with chestnut brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She wore jeans, a soft cream sweater, and an expression so calm, so achingly familiar, that the world seemed to tilt around him. Grace. He blinked, certain it had to be his imagination. But no, it was her. The tilt of her chin, the curve of her shoulders, the way she bent slightly as she spoke to a small girl clutching her hand. The girl, no older than 5, had golden blonde curls and bright blue eyes that sparkled as she looked up at her mother. Blue eyes. Ethan's breath caught. For a moment, he forgot to breathe altogether. The child laughed, and even through the glass in the distance, Ethan heard the echo of his own laughter from long ago, that same light tone, that same lilt at the end of each word. He leaned forward, his pulse thundering in his ears. "Stop the car," he said abruptly. Mark looked in the mirror, startled. "Sir, just stop." The tires hissed against the pavement as the car eased to the side of the road. Ethan stared through the window, his mind spinning, every logical thought collapsing under the weight of recognition. It couldn't be. It had to be. The resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of her eyes, the arch of her eyebrows, even the small dimple that appeared when she smiled, all of it his. Every cell in his body screamed with a kind of terrible, beautiful certainty. He watched as the little girl chattered about something, tugging on Grace's hand. Grace laughed that soft, genuine laugh he hadn't heard in years and crouched to fix the strap of the child's backpack. She brushed a lock of hair from the girl's forehead and kissed her temple before leading her toward a small blue sedan parked along the curb. Ethan's hand tightened on his knee. His throat felt raw, his chest tight. For 5 years, he had lived in sterile rooms, surrounded by glass and metal and money, and not once had he felt this alive or this undone. He wanted to open the door, to run across the street, to ask the questions pounding in his chest. Is she mine? Why didn't you tell me? How many birthdays have I missed? But he didn't move. Something inside him, fear, disbelief, shame, rooted him to the seat. "Everything all right, Mr. Caldwell?" Mark asked carefully. Ethan couldn't find his voice. He nodded vaguely, eyes locked on the scene before him. Grace opened the car door and helped the girl climb into a booster seat. She leaned in to buckle the straps, her movements patient, familiar. Then she shut the door, circled around, and slid into the driver's seat. The car pulled away slowly, merging into the line of traffic heading down Maple Street. Without thinking, Ethan spoke. Follow them. Mark hesitated. Sir, please, just keep a distance. Mark glanced at him through the rearview mirror, uncertainty flickering across his face. But he obeyed. They followed at a cautious pace through the small streets of Ashbrook. Grace's car turned past a white church, then a row of shops, the florist, the bakery, the cafe with its chalkboard sign advertising homemade pie. The town was alive with small, simple motions, a world Ethan had long forgotten. Grace turned down a narrow lane shaded by trees. The road dipped slightly before opening onto a quiet neighborhood of small, well-loved houses. She slowed, pulling into the driveway of a modest blue house with flower boxes beneath the windows and a swing hanging from the porch beam. Ethan's pulse hammered. The blue paint was weathered, the yard tidy, a single apple tree standing near the fence. He could picture Grace there sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee, her daughter playing in the grass. It was so ordinary, so achingly beautiful, that it stole his breath. When Grace parked, the little girl unbuckled herself and bounded out of the car, racing toward the porch. Grace called after her, laughing, her voice carrying faintly across the street. Ethan's throat tightened. He pressed a hand against his chest, as if to keep something fragile from breaking loose inside. The girl disappeared through the front door, and Grace followed, glancing once toward the road not suspiciously, just in the absent-minded way people do when sensing eyes on them. Ethan ducked his head, heart pounding. When he looked up again, the door had closed. For several seconds, he sat frozen, staring at the house. The sun had dipped lower, casting the yard in a warm, honeyed glow. A wind stirred the branches of the apple tree, scattering a few pale petals across the grass. He whispered her name, barely audible. Grace. Mark shifted uneasily. Should I continue? Sir Ethan tore his gaze from the house, his voice rough. No, just wait. They sat there in silence, the hum of the engine filling the car. Ethan's mind reeled with questions he couldn't yet form. The shock ran so deep it almost numbed him. If the child was his, and every instinct screamed she was, then what did that mean? 5 years lost. First words, first steps, first days of school, all gone, all lived without him. He pressed a hand over his mouth, his breath trembling. Regret flooded through him, sharp and merciless. He had thought he'd built everything he needed, but here, parked on a quiet street in a small town he'd never planned to visit, he realized how wrong he'd been. He wasn't looking at what he had lost. He was looking at what he could have been, the life that might have been his if he hadn't let pride win. Drive us back, he said finally, voice low. Not yet. Just not yet. As the car pulled away, Ethan looked out the rear window one last time. The blue house grew smaller, the apple tree swaying gently in the breeze. He didn't know how or when, but he knew this wasn't the end of that story. Something inside him, something long asleep, had just awakened. Ethan Caldwell didn't sleep that night. The image of the little girl haunted him, those blue eyes, the exact shade of his own, bright and curious beneath a halo of golden curls. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her laugh. Every time he blinked, he saw Grace's hand resting gently on her daughter's shoulder. He paced his penthouse long past midnight, the city below pulsing with its usual rhythm of lights and sirens. But he heard none of it. The empire he had built, the meetings, the deals, the relentless ambition suddenly felt like scaffolding around an empty space. By dawn, exhaustion had turned into determination. He needed answers, not guesses, not coincidences, answers. At 8 o'clock sharp, Ethan called his private investigator, Thomas Keene, a discreet man who had handled corporate security matters for years. Thomas, Ethan said, his voice tight, I need you to find someone for me. There was a pause. Of course, sir. Who a woman? Grace Mitchell. Used to be Grace Caldwell. His throat tightened as he said her name aloud. She lives somewhere near Ashbrook, Oregon. I need everything: address, employment, records, family, And if she has a child, Thomas hesitated only a second. Understood. How far back should I go? Ethan stared at the skyline outside his window, the sun breaking weakly through the clouds. Go back 6 years. Give me 48 hours, Thomas said. Make it 24. Ethan hung up and sank into his chair. His hands trembled as he rubbed his temples. He had been in control of everything his entire life, or at least, he had believed so. But now, control felt meaningless. He had seen her, seen the child, and there was no logic in the world strong enough to make that resemblance an accident. Hours crawled by. He tried to work, answering emails, reviewing projections, even stepping into a board meeting by video. But his mind wasn't there. Every spreadsheet looked like static. Every voice sounded far away. By evening, the call came. Thomas's voice on the line was calm, professional, but beneath it, Ethan could hear hesitation, the kind of tone people use when delivering bad news. I have what you asked for, Thomas began. Grace Mitchell, 38, freelance graphic designer, lives in Ashbrook, small rental house on Maple Lane, divorced 6 years ago from one Ethan Caldwell. Ethan closed his eyes, bracing. Go on. She has one child. Thomas continued. A daughter, Lily Mae Mitchell, born 5 years ago, roughly 8 months after your divorce was finalized. The words hit like a blow to the chest. Ethan stood, gripping the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. 8 months? Yes, sir. He didn't speak for several seconds. The sound of his own breathing filled the room, ragged, uneven. It means, Thomas said gently. She was pregnant when you divorced. Ethan felt the ground tilt beneath him. His mind reeled, memories unraveling like film played backward. The day of the divorce, the rain on the office window, Grace's trembling hands as she signed her name, the way she wouldn't look at him. He had walked out that day certain she was angry, certain she wanted to be free of him. He had no idea she had been carrying his child. How old did you say she was? Ethan asked, his voice cracking. 5, sir. Started kindergarten last fall. 5 years. 5 birthdays he hadn't known existed. 5 Christmas mornings. 5 years of first words, first steps, scraped knees, bedtime stories all lived without him. Ethan sank into his chair, his head in his hands. God, he whispered. God. What have I done? Thomas's voice softened. Do you want me to continue with the report? School, health, photos? No. Ethan said quickly. That's enough. His voice was a hoarse whisper. That's enough. He hung up before Thomas could say another word. For a long time, he just sat there in the dark, the only light coming from the city beyond the glass. He stared at his reflection, a man who had everything and yet had missed the only thing that mattered. The anger came first. It burned hot and fast. How could she keep this from me, he thought. How could Grace make that choice alone? He stood abruptly, pacing, his pulse racing. She had no right. He muttered to the empty room. No right to keep my daughter from me. But the fury faded as quickly as it came, replaced by something heavier, deeper shame, because the more he thought about it, the more he knew why she hadn't told him. He had been gone long before the divorce papers were signed, absent at dinner tables, distracted at doctor appointments, building an empire while their marriage starved on the sidelines. He had chosen ambition over her over them. And now, the universe had delivered the cruelest kind of symmetry. He had gained everything he thought he wanted and lost everything he couldn't replace. Ethan crossed to the bar, poured himself another drink, then stopped halfway through and set it down untouched. His throat ached, but not from thirst. He walked to the shelf where Grace's old sketch still stood. Home in the Rain. He picked it up, his fingers trembling. You were trying to tell me, he whispered. You were trying to tell me what mattered, and I didn't listen. He sank onto the couch, the sketch in his lap. The city outside blurred into streaks of gold and gray. He pictured the little blue house again, the apple tree in the yard, the laughter spilling from behind the windows. His daughter. The words felt both foreign and familiar. He whispered them aloud, testing the sound. My daughter. Something broke inside him, not like glass shattering, but like ice finally cracking under the first touch of spring. The tears came then, quietly at first, then, in deep, shuddering waves. He covered his face with both hands and let himself unravel. When the sobs finally subsided, the silence that followed was different, not the empty silence of his penthouse, but a hollow filled with purpose. He had lost 5 years. He would not lose another day. Ethan stood, setting the sketch carefully back on the shelf. His reflection in the window looked older, yes, but steadier, a man stripped bare of excuses. He didn't yet know how Grace would react, what words he would say, or if she would even open the door when he came. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity tomorrow. He was going to Ashbrook, not as the CEO of a billion-dollar company, not as the man who had built towers of glass and metal, but as a father, and as a man finally ready to face what he had run from. The morning in Ashbrook began like any other, soft light seeping through curtains, the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen, the rustle of a child's laughter somewhere down the hall. Grace Mitchell stood at the stove, flipping pancakes while Lily sat at the table coloring, her tongue poking out in concentration. The kitchen window was open, and the scent of wet earth drifted in from the yard. Outside, the apple tree shimmered with dew, its branches heavy with blossoms. For 5 years, mornings had been like this, quiet, steady, full of small rituals that felt like peace. Grace had learned to love the rhythm of ordinary life school lunches, bedtime stories, evenings on the porch with Maggie. She had convinced herself the past was gone, safely buried under years of distance and silence, until the doorbell rang. It wasn't a friendly knock or a delivery tap. It was deliberate, steady, final. Grace froze, the spatula still in her hand. Her first thought was, Maggie forgot her scarf again. But something deep in her gut twisted differently, a sense she couldn't name. A heartbeat gone suddenly off tempo. Mommy. Who's that? Lily asked, looking up from her crayons. I'm not sure. Sweetheart, Grace said softly. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked toward the door. When she pulled it open, the world tilted. Ethan Caldwell stood on her porch. For a heartbeat, she couldn't move. He looked almost exactly as she remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, his presence filling the space around him, yet time had carved new lines into his face. The gray at his temples, the weary depth behind his blue eyes, the faint tremor in his breath. He wasn't the man who'd walked out of the lawyer's office all those years ago. He was someone changed, and that frightened her more than if he hadn't changed at all. Grace, he said, just her name. But his voice broke on it. Her fingers tightened on the doorframe. Ethan! For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of a lawnmower down the street and the faint drip of water from the porch roof. Finally, she found her voice. What are you doing here? He swallowed, his jaw tightening. I think you know. Grace shook her head, stepping back slightly. No, Ethan, I don't. You shouldn't be here. He took one step forward, not crossing the threshold, but close enough for her to see the tremor in his hand. I saw you, he said quietly, at the school. Her breath caught. You and her. He continued, your daughter. His eyes burned into hers. Our daughter. Grace's heart lurched for a second. She couldn't speak. Ethan, please. He cut her off, his voice raw. She's mine, isn't she? The words landed like thunder. Grace looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Her throat closed. I deserve an answer, he said, stepping closer, his tone still low but edged with desperation. Don't lie to me, Grace. Not about this. She felt the sting of tears rise behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. You don't understand. I understand enough, he said. His voice shook, equal parts fury and grief. I understand that my daughter is 5 years old. I understand that she was born 8 months after our divorce. I understand that I missed her first words, her first steps, her birthday's everything, because you decided I didn't deserve to know. Grace's lips trembled. You walked away. Ethan, you made it clear there was no room for me or anyone else in your life back then. He exhaled sharply, as if struck. I was wrong, he said. God, I was so wrong. But you still had no right to take her from me. I didn't take her, Grace whispered. I protected her. From what? From me. His voice cracked. From the father who would have loved her. Grace looked up at him then, eyes brimming. From the man who couldn't love anyone, not really. You were so lost in proving yourself that there was nothing left for us. You think I didn't want to tell you I did? I sat on the bathroom floor that day with that test in my hand and wanted to call you. But you wouldn't have listened. You never listened. Ethan's shoulders sagged, the fight bleeding out of him. He looked suddenly older, smaller. You're right, he said quietly. I didn't listen. I was proud and blind and stupid. But I'm listening now. Grace pressed her lips together, shaking her head. It's too late. Ethan? Don't say that, he said, taking another step closer. Don't tell me it's too late to know my own child. Her breath trembled. You can't just show up after 5 years and expect to walk into her life. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I just want the truth. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Then Grace nodded, the smallest motion. But it was enough. Yes, she whispered. She's yours. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irreversible. Ethan closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. When he opened them again, they glistened. Thank you, he said softly, for telling me, even if it's 5 years too late. Before Grace could reply, a small voice floated from behind her. Mommy? Who's at the door? Both adults froze. Lily stood in the hallway, holding her stuffed rabbit, her face bright and curious. Her golden curls caught the light, and her blue eyes. Ethan's eyes blinked up at the stranger on the porch. Grace's heart pounded. Sweetheart, she said quickly, her voice gentle but urgent. Go finish your drawing. Okay, Mommy's just talking to someone. Okay, Lily said, still looking at Ethan. Hi. Ethan swallowed hard, his lips parting, but no sound came out. He wanted to speak, to say hi back, to tell her everything his heart was screaming. I'm your father. I've missed you every day and didn't even know it. But he couldn't. Not yet. Grace turned, her eyes pleading. Please, she whispered. Not here, not now. Something in her tone, the quiet desperation. The fear reached him. Ethan nodded slowly. All right. His voice came out rough. Tonight. After she's asleep. We'll talk then. Grace hesitated, then gave a small, reluctant nod. 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock, he repeated, as if anchoring the words to the air. For a moment, they just stood there, two people separated by years of silence and the width of a doorway. Then Ethan stepped back, his expression unreadable. She's beautiful, he said softly. Grace's voice trembled. I know. He turned and walked down the porch steps, his shoes echoing against the wooden boards. Grace watched him go, her hands shaking as she gripped the doorknob. Lily had already disappeared down the hall, humming to herself, blissfully unaware that her world had just shifted. When Ethan reached the car parked at the curb, he paused and looked back. Grace still stood in the doorway, framed by morning light, neither waved, neither smiled, and yet, in that silent exchange, both knew the time for hiding was over. Tonight, the truth would demand its reckoning. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, each second a whisper in the stillness. Outside, Ashbrook lay wrapped in twilight streetlights glowing amber, the faint scent of rain drifting through the open window. Inside the small blue house, everything was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic breathing of a sleeping child down the hall. Grace sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea gone cold. She'd spent the evening pretending everything was normal, helping Lily brush her teeth, reading Goodnight Moon, tucking her in with her favorite stuffed rabbit, but her mind had been elsewhere, circling endlessly around the moment at the door, the look in Ethan's eyes, the tremor in his voice. Now, at precisely 8 o'clock, there was a knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps. She stood, smoothing her sweater, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. When she opened the door, Ethan was there, the same dark coat, the same tired eyes, but something softer in his face now. Less anger, more ache. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. Grace hesitated, then stepped aside. "She's asleep." He nodded and entered, his gaze sweeping the room. Everything about the space spoke of a life simple but full children's drawings on the fridge, a pile of books on the table, a faint scent of vanilla candles. He took it in like someone reading the story of years he'd missed. "Tea," Grace offered, her voice fragile. "No, thank you," he said, though his throat looked dry. He stood for a moment before finally sitting on the edge of the armchair across from her. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, Ethan broke it. "Tell me." Grace blinked. "Tell you what? The truth," he said. "All of it." She looked down at her hands, at the chipped edge of her mug. "I don't even know where to start." "Start with the day you left," he said. "The day you signed the papers." The memory hit her like a wave. The rain on the windows, the smell of paper and ink, the weight of silence heavier than words could ever be. Grace took a deep breath. "I found out that morning," she began softly, "about the baby." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I took the test before I left for the lawyer's office," she continued. "I thought maybe it would change something. Maybe if I told you, we'd find a way back. But when I saw you sitting there," her voice cracked, "you looked so cold, Ethan, like we were strangers signing a business contract, not ending a marriage." He stared at her, eyes dark with guilt. "I was angry," he admitted, "at everything, at myself, at you, at the fact that I couldn't fix what I'd already broken." "I know," she said quietly, "but back then, I couldn't see that. All I saw was a man who had already chosen his empire over me." He exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping. "And so, you decided for both of us." Grace's eyes filled. "I was scared. I didn't think I could handle another rejection. I thought if I told you, you'd feel trapped, or worse, resentful. I couldn't bring a child into that kind of emptiness." She looked up then, her gaze meeting his. "You think I didn't want to tell you I did. Every single day. But I'd watch the news, see your face on the covers, hear about your success. And I told myself, you were better off without us." Ethan's voice rose, sharp and wounded. "You had no right." The words came out louder than he meant, slicing through the air. Lily stirred faintly in the next room, and both of them froze until the house went quiet again. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was lower, trembling. "You had no right to decide that for me. To take those years, 5 years, and erase them." Grace's tears slipped free. "You're right," she whispered. "I didn't have the right. But I also didn't have the strength to risk hearing you say you didn't want her. Or me." He flinched, as if struck. His anger faltered, replaced by something softer, grief, understanding, regret. He rubbed his hand across his face, his voice barely audible. "I would have wanted her," he said, "even if I was too broken to show it." They sat in silence, 2 people on opposite shores of the same sorrow. Finally, Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You must have been terrified." "I was," she admitted. "But I also felt something else. When I first held her, when I saw her eyes, I knew I'd made the right choice, even if it was the hardest one of my life. She deserved peace. Ethan, not a war between her parents." He nodded slowly, staring at the floor. "And I deserved the truth." "Yes," she said softly. "You did." He looked up, his eyes glassy. "I keep thinking about what I missed, her first words, the first time she called you mommy, her first day of school." His voice cracked. "I should have been there. You weren't ready, Grace said gently. Neither of us was. Her words weren't meant as an excuse, just truth. And it hung there, quiet and unflinching, between them. Ethan leaned back, exhaling shakily. When I saw her, he said, I thought I was dreaming. She looked up at you with those blue eyes, and I knew. I didn't need a test. I didn't need a report. I just knew. Grace closed her eyes. I always wondered if she'd look like you. She does, he said, his voice softening. She has your kindness, though. I could see it even in the way she smiled. The silence that followed wasn't sharp anymore. It was heavy, yes, but filled with the tentative warmth of shared pain. The kind of silence that happens when two people stop defending themselves long enough to hear one another breathe. Finally, Ethan stood and walked to the window. The moonlight spilled across his face, washing away years of pride. I don't know how to make this right, he said quietly, but I want to try. Grace set her mug down and rose, crossing her arms as if holding herself together. You can't just appear and fix everything. Ethan, she doesn't know you. I know, he said. That's why I want to take it slow. I want to meet her properly. Let her get to know me. As a friend first, if that's what it takes. Grace studied him, her expression wary but softening. You really mean that? He nodded. I've spent my whole life building things that didn't matter. This is what matters. For the first time that night, Grace saw something in his eyes that had been missing for years. Humility. Not the man who wanted to win, but the man who finally understood the cost of his victories. She sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. You hurt me deeply. Ethan, I know, he said, and you hurt me too. But maybe that's what happens when two people love each other and forget how to listen. Her eyes met his, shimmering. Maybe. The clock ticked on. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded lonely, but steady. Grace took a breath, then nodded slightly. We'll talk about it tomorrow. About how to tell her. Ethan's shoulders dropped in relief. Thank you. As he turned to leave, she said quietly, Ethan. He looked back. She loves stories, Grace said. If you want to start somewhere, start there. He smiled faintly. The first real smile in years. Stories I can do. When the door closed behind him, Grace stood for a long moment, listening to the quiet. The night felt different, heavier, yet somehow lighter. In the other room, Lily stirred and whispered in her sleep, Mommy. Grace walked to her daughter's room and tucked the blanket closer around her small body. She brushed a kiss across her forehead and whispered, Everything's going to change, sweetheart. But maybe that's okay. The morning air in Ashbrook carried the scent of wet earth and apple blossoms, sunlight pooling softly across the small blue house on Maple Lane. Grace woke before dawn, her heart uneasy, her mind replaying every word from the night before. Today was the day her past and present would finally collide. In Lily's room, sunlight danced across pink curtains dotted with stars. Grace sat beside her daughter's bed, watching the slow rhythm of her breathing. How do you tell a child something that will change her world forever? When Lily stirred, rubbing her eyes, Grace managed a small smile. Morning, sunshine, morning. Mommy, the little girl mumbled, sitting up and hugging her stuffed rabbit. Are we doing pancakes? Grace brushed a curl from her daughter's forehead. Maybe later. There's someone I want you to meet today. Lily blinked. Someone from church. Grace shook her head. No, sweetheart. Someone important. The child tilted her head, curious. A friend. Grace hesitated, her voice softening. Yes, a very special friend. Lily seemed satisfied with that answer for now. She ran off to dress herself, singing under her breath, while Grace leaned against the doorway, her pulse hammering. By mid-morning, the house was spotless, the kind of nervous tidiness that happens when one is trying to control what can't be controlled. Fresh flowers on the table, 2 cups waiting on the counter. At exactly 10 o'clock, A car door closed outside. Grace's breath caught. She turned toward the window and saw Ethan step out. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit, just jeans and a navy sweater. But something about his posture, his careful movements, told her this was not a casual visit. He looked like a man about to walk into the most important meeting of his life, one that could break him or save him. Grace met him at the door, her expression calm but tense. "She's in the living room," she said quietly. "I told her you're a friend." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight for words. When he stepped inside, the air felt charged, fragile, electric. Lily was on the floor, arranging crayons by color. She looked up at the sound of the door, her blue eyes bright. "Hi," she chirped. Ethan froze. His breath hitched. For a second, he couldn't move, couldn't think. This close. The resemblance was overwhelming, the same eyes, the same dimple, even the little tilt of the chin when she smiled. "Hi," he managed, his voice trembling slightly. "You must be Lily." The girl nodded proudly. "That's me. Mommy said you're her friend." "I am," Ethan said softly. "I've wanted to meet you for a very long time." She frowned, curious. "You know me?" His throat ached. "Not yet," he said gently. "But I'd like to." Grace watched from the doorway, her arms crossed not in anger, but in self-protection. Her eyes followed every move, every flicker of emotion between them. Lily studied Ethan for a long moment. Then, in that clear, guileless way only a child possesses, she asked, "Why are your eyes like mine?" The question struck like lightning, innocent, pure, impossible to dodge. Grace's breath caught. Ethan blinked rapidly, his lips parting, but no words coming out. Before either could respond, Lily added, "Mommy says I got my eyes from someone who lives far away." "Do you live far away?" Ethan crouched down so he was level with her. His voice was barely a whisper. "I used to, but I don't want to anymore." Something in his tone, a quiet honesty, made Grace's eyes sting. Lily tilted her head, studying him. Then, after a pause that felt like eternity, she asked softly, "Are you my daddy?" The world seemed to stop. Even the clock on the wall fell silent in Grace's ears. Ethan's eyes filled before he could speak. He didn't know how she knew, whether it was intuition, some invisible connection, or simply the way children sense truth before adults dare to name it. He swallowed hard. "Yes," he whispered, "I'm your daddy." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Lily's lower lip trembled. "You came back," she said, her voice tiny. Ethan's chest broke open. "I came back," he said, the words thick with emotion. And then, without hesitation, without fear, Lily stood and walked straight into his arms. Ethan caught her, his body shaking with the force of it. The hug was small and fierce and holy, the kind of embrace that mends years of absence in a single heartbeat. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the faint scent of crayons and apple shampoo, his tears wetting her curls. "I'm so sorry," he whispered against her ear. "I should have been here. I missed everything, and I didn't even know I was missing it." Lily didn't understand the words, but she clung tighter, as if her little arms could hold him together. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're here now." Grace turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She had imagined this moment 100 times, feared it, hoped for it, dreaded its pain, but nothing had prepared her for its beauty. After a long while, Lily pulled back just enough to look at Ethan's face. "Can you read me a story?" she asked. Ethan let out a shaky laugh, still holding her. "Yeah," he said, smiling through tears. "I'd like that." Grace stepped forward and retrieved Lily's favorite book from the shelf, The Little Engine That Could. She placed it in Ethan's hands. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting spark of old tenderness passing between them. Ethan sat on the couch. Lily snuggled against his side, her small hand resting trustingly on his arm. As he began to read, his voice low and warm, Grace leaned against the doorway, watching. His tone was unsure at first, but soon it softened, settled, became natural. Lily giggled when he made the train whistle sounds, her laughter lighting the room like sunlight through rain. Grace smiled through her tears. For years she had carried guilt like a shadow, convinced she'd stolen something precious. But watching them together, father and daughter, strangers rediscovering love, she realized that maybe this was how redemption looked, not perfect, not easy, but real. When the story ended, Lily yawned and leaned her head against Ethan's chest. "Will you come again?" she murmured sleepily. Ethan's hand trembled as he stroked her hair. "If your mommy says it's okay," he said softly. Grace met his gaze over their daughter's head. For the first time in years, she didn't see the man who had broken her heart. She saw the man who was trying to mend it. She nodded once. "It's okay." Ethan smiled, tears glistening in his eyes. As Lily drifted to sleep against him, the house fell quiet except for the gentle ticking of the clock, steady, forgiving, alive. Outside, the apple tree swayed in the breeze, petals scattering like blessings on the grass below. Inside, three hearts once separated by pride and pain began to beat, tentatively, in rhythm again. The weeks that followed unfolded gently, like the first pages of a new chapter, written in pencil, cautious, imperfect, but full of hope. Every Saturday morning, Ethan's car appeared quietly on Maple Lane at 10 o'clock sharp. The first few times, he sat in the driveway for several minutes before knocking, gathering courage. But each week it grew easier, not easy, but easier, as if his heart was slowly remembering how to belong to something other than work. Lily would always be waiting. She'd press her face against the window, squealing, "He's here, Mommy," before running to the door barefoot, her curls bouncing with excitement. And every time Ethan saw her, that small figure bursting with joy, something inside him healed a little more. Their first few Saturdays were simple storybooks and coloring pages, quiet walks to the park down the street. But simplicity had its own kind of magic. Lily would chatter endlessly, asking about everything from why the sky changed color to whether butterflies had birthdays. Ethan didn't always have the answers, but he loved the questions. He'd kneel beside her in the grass, studying ants and dandelions with the same curiosity she did. It felt like rediscovering wonder through her eyes, the wonder he'd traded away years ago for boardrooms and deadlines. One Saturday, Lily asked if they could make a kite. "A big one," she said, stretching her arms wide, with colors like the sunset. Grace, who was trimming the apple tree nearby, smiled. "That sounds like a good project for you two." Ethan grinned, pretending confidence. How hard can it be? It turned out harder than he remembered. They spent the morning sprawled on the porch, surrounded by colored paper, string, and a stubborn roll of tape that kept sticking to itself. Lily giggled at his failed attempts, and Grace laughed from the doorway, shaking her head. "You're supposed to tie the frame, not glue it," she teased. "Engineer error," Ethan replied, chuckling. "We're learning on the job." By noon, the kite stood tall and slightly crooked, a patchwork of orange, pink, and gold. They carried it to the open field behind the school, the wind tugging eagerly at the string. "Ready?" he asked. Lily nodded fiercely. Ready, Ethan ran, the kite lifting, wobbling, then soaring. Lily squealed, racing beside him, her laughter carrying across the field. For the first time in years, Ethan laughed too freely, without pretense or reserve. Grace watched from the edge of the grass, arms folded, the sunlight catching in her hair. It had been so long since she'd seen Ethan smile like that, not the practiced corporate smile he used for cameras, but the real one that reached his eyes. When the kite finally drifted down, Lily ran to her mother, breathless and glowing. "Mommy!" It flew. Daddy made it fly. Grace glanced up at Ethan, who was jogging toward them with the kite in one hand, his sweater streaked with grass stains. For a fleeting moment, she saw not the man who had broken her heart, but the one she had once danced with in the rain, the one who used to make her laugh so hard her sides hurt. "Good job, team," she said softly. Ethan smiled, meeting her eyes with quiet gratitude. Couldn't have done it without the coach. That afternoon, they sat together on the porch, drinking lemonade while Lily drew the kite in her sketchbook. The conversation was like the weather, Lily's new teacher, a movie she wanted to see, but beneath it ran a deeper current, the kind that hums between two people learning to trust again. Grace noticed small things about him now, how he listened more than he spoke, how he slowed down his words when Lily asked a question, how he didn't check his phone once. He had changed, not just in the way he looked or spoke, but in the quiet humility that wrapped around him like a second skin. Later that evening, when Ethan rose to leave, Lily clung to his leg. "You'll come back, right?" He crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'll be here next Saturday. Promise. You pinky promise." He smiled, linking his pinky with hers. Always. When he left, Grace watched his car disappear down the street, the evening sun catching the windows of the blue house. She felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. Cautious, but real. By the third weekend, routine had become rhythm. Saturday mornings meant pancakes and laughter, trips to the farmer's market, building Lego castles that collapsed as quickly as they rose. Ethan had even learned how to braid poorly, but with enthusiasm. One morning, as he clumsily tried to weave Lily's hair, she giggled. "You're funny, Daddy. Funny bad or funny good? Funny good," she said, smiling at him through the mirror. Grace, standing in the doorway, bit her lip to keep from crying. Those two words, funny good, echoed in her chest like a benediction. That afternoon, while Lily napped on the couch, Grace and Ethan sat outside on the porch. The air smelled of cut grass and lilacs. "She talks about you all week," Grace said quietly. Ethan looked down, a small smile playing at his lips. "She talks a lot about you too. You've done an incredible job with her." Grace glanced away. "I did my best. You did more than that," he said. "You gave her a life full of love." She met his eyes. "And now you're part of that life too." For a long time, they sat in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Ethan glanced toward the apple tree. "It's funny," he said softly. 5 years ago, I thought I'd built something unshakable. A company, a legacy, but all of it feels so small now." Grace nodded, her voice gentle. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what matters." He turned to her, a faint smile on his lips. "And what matters is this." She hesitated, then said, "It's a start." As summer deepened, their Saturdays became stories of small steps. Lily learned to ride her bike with Ethan jogging beside her, cheering her on. Grace began letting him stay a little longer each time for dinner, for bedtime stories, for quiet conversations after Lily drifted off. Sometimes Grace would catch him looking at their daughter with a kind of reverence that made her chest ache, and sometimes she caught him looking at her the same way. But for now, she told herself, it was enough to share laughter, to share space, to share the slow rebuilding of trust. One evening, as Ethan prepared to leave, Lily ran out onto the porch in her pajamas, clutching her rabbit. "Daddy, wait." He turned, crouching to meet her eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" She held out a small paper heart she'd cut herself. "So, you don't forget me?" Ethan's voice broke as he took it. "I could never forget you." Grace watched, silent, her heart swelling with something both painful and beautiful. When the door closed behind him, she stood in the quiet house, the echoes of laughter still hanging in the air. Life wasn't perfect, it was far from easy, but it was real. And for the first time in a long, long while, Grace felt that maybe, just maybe, they were all finding their way home. The invitation came on thick ivory paper, embossed with gold. It looked so out of place on Grace's modest kitchen table that she almost laughed when she opened it, almost. The words were Simple Caldwell Innovations, Annual Charity Gala, Saturday, 7 p.m. bed, the Grand Portland Ballroom dress formal, and beneath that, a handwritten note in Ethan's careful script. "I'd like you and Lily to come. No expectations. Just an evening together. E. Grace stared at the note for a long time. The woman she used to be the one who'd attended such events on his arm, smiling through polite conversations, had vanished long ago. The idea of stepping back into that world felt foreign. But when she told Lily, her daughter's face lit up like morning sunlight. A fancy party. Lily gasped, "Can I wear my sparkly dress?" Grace couldn't say no to that smile. "Of course, sweetheart," she said softly. "We'll both wear something nice." Saturday night arrived wrapped in the shimmer of city lights. The Grand Portland Ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, its marble floors alive with the hum of conversation, the soft clink of champagne glasses, and the murmur of a live jazz band playing in the corner. Women in satin gowns drifted like petals through the room, and men in dark suits spoke in the language of business and polished laughter. It was a world Grace remembered too well, elegant, expensive, and suffocating. Yet, when the doors opened and she stepped inside with Lily at her side, heads turned. Grace wore a deep blue dress borrowed from Maggie, simple but graceful. Her hair, pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, caught the light each time she moved. And Lily, in her pink tulle dress with a silver bow, held her mother's hand proudly, her eyes wide with wonder. Ethan was waiting near the entrance. For a heartbeat, he forgot how to breathe. The sight of them, Grace serene and radiant, Lily glowing with innocence, undid him completely. He walked toward them slowly, his heart hammering. "You're both." His voice faltered before finding itself again. "You're both beautiful." Lily twirled in place. "Mommy let me wear sparkles." Ethan smiled. "You look like the brightest star in the room." Grace felt warmth bloom in her chest despite herself. "You clean up pretty well, too," she said quietly. He offered his arm. "Shall we?" Grace hesitated, then took it. The gesture felt strangely natural, as though time had only paused, not erased what they once were. As the evening unfolded, Ethan stayed close to them. He guided them through introductions, his hand resting lightly on Grace's back, never possessive, only protective. He introduced Lily proudly to his colleagues, who knelt to greet her as she showed them the paper heart she carried everywhere. "This is my daughter," Ethan said softly more than once, the words still new but full of wonder. "And this is her mother, Grace." Each time he said it, Grace felt something inside her shift, something old and bruised beginning to heal. They found their seats near the front, beneath cascading lights. The air smelled of roses and champagne. A pianist began to play a slow, lilting melody that tugged at the edges of memory. Lily leaned against her mother's arm, whispering, "Mommy, it's like a fairy tale." Grace smiled, almost, "Sweetheart." Across the table, Ethan watched them, his gaze soft but full of longing. For years, he had stood in rooms like this surrounded by wealth and applause. Yet tonight, sitting with Grace and their daughter, he felt rich for the first time. When the speeches began, Grace expected the usual corporate rhythm, charity goals, donor acknowledgments, polite applause. But when Ethan stepped onto the stage, she sensed something different in his voice before he even began. He looked out over the crowd rows of investors, partners, executives then, down at the table where Grace and Lily sat. "Tonight," he began, "we're here to celebrate community, generosity, and second chances." The words made Grace's breath catch. "For years," Ethan continued, "I thought success meant building something bigger, faster, stronger. But what I've learned the hard way is that the greatest thing we can build is connection. The kind that heals, that forgives, that gives meaning to what we create." He paused, his gaze steady on Grace. "I wouldn't be standing here tonight if it weren't for two people in this room," he said. "They've taught me more about love, humility, and grace, no pun intended, than any boardroom ever could." A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, but his tone remained reverent. Ethan's voice softened. "So, if you'll forgive me for being personal, I want to take this moment to thank them publicly." He gestured toward their table. "My daughter, Lily, my heart, and her mother, Grace Mitchell, the woman I'm fighting to win back. The room fell silent. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. Every face turned toward her, but all she could see was Ethan standing there, vulnerable, stripped of pride and pretense. The words hung in the air, simple but monumental. Lily looked up at her mother, whispering loudly, "He said your name." Mommy Grace let out a shaky breath, half laugh, half sob. Ethan's voice broke slightly as he finished. "Life gives us few chances to make things right. I plan to take everyone I'm given." When he stepped down, applause filled the room, polite at first, then warm, then thunderous. But Grace barely heard it. She was still staring at him, her heart a confused, aching tangle of disbelief and emotion. As he returned to the table, she whispered, "You didn't have to say that." "I did," he replied softly. "Because for the first time in my life, I meant every word." Lily tugged on Grace's sleeve. "Mommy, are you crying?" Grace smiled through her tears. "Happy tears, sweetheart. Later." As music filled the ballroom and people rose to dance, Ethan extended his hand. One dance, Grace hesitated, then took it. He held her carefully, respectfully, as they swayed beneath the chandeliers. For a moment, it felt like coming home to a memory she hadn't dared to touch. "You embarrassed me," she murmured, her head against his shoulder. He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I also told the truth." When the song ended, she didn't step away immediately. They stood there, the crowd fading, the world holding its breath around them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close understanding, fragile and real. That night, as they drove back to Ashbrook, Lily fell asleep in the back seat, her paper heart clutched in her hand. Grace looked out the window, city lights gliding by. "You really are changing," she said quietly. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, a soft smile curving his lips. "I'm trying," he replied. "For both of you." She turned to look at him. Really look, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe him. Outside, the city faded into dark hills, and the silence between them felt peaceful, filled not with what had been lost, but with what might still be found. The house on Maple Lane smelled of vanilla frosting and laughter. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows, pooling over pink balloons and paper streamers. Grace stood at the counter, her hair tucked loosely behind her ear as she carefully arranged cupcakes on a stand. Across the room, Ethan hung the last of the decorations, a banner that read, "Happy 6th Birthday," Lily in glittering gold letters. The sight of him balancing on a chair, tongue pressed in concentration as he tried to tape the ends straight, made Grace smile despite herself. "Crooked," she said gently. He looked over his shoulder, grinning. "Artist's intention." "Mm-hmm." Lily burst into the room then, wearing a paper crown Maggie had made for her cheeks pink with excitement. "Is it time yet?" she squealed. "Almost." "Sweetheart," Grace said, "you can help Daddy set the table." Ethan froze for half a second at the word Daddy, though she had said it casually. Unthinking. The sound of it still felt like a gift each time it passed her lips. "Come on." "Birthday girl," he said, shaking it off with a smile. "You're the boss today." The morning unfolded in cheerful chaos, neighbors dropping by with small gifts, Maggie arriving with balloons and an enormous bowl of fruit salad, Lily running between the kitchen and backyard with a streamer in one hand and her stuffed rabbit in the other. It wasn't a grand party, just a small gathering under the apple tree, but it was perfect. Grace watched from the porch as Ethan and Lily played a clumsy version of tag, both laughing so hard they could barely run straight. At one point, Ethan scooped her up and spun her in the air, her giggles ringing out like music. For years, Grace had done everything alone. Now, watching the two of them together, she felt something settle quietly in her chest, the sense of a circle closing, a wound finally beginning to heal. As afternoon sunlight mellowed into gold, the last guests waved goodbye. Maggie kissed Grace's cheek, whispering, "You did good, honey," before heading home. Inside, the house was warm with the smell of frosting and candle smoke. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, Unwrapping her last present, a small wooden jewelry box Ethan had carved himself. Inside lay a silver chain with a tiny heart charm. "Did you make this?" she asked, her eyes wide. He nodded, smiling. "Every bit. It's beautiful." She threw her arms around his neck. "Thank you, Daddy." Grace watched the moment quietly, her eyes glistening. After cake and cleanup, the three of them sat in the living room, surrounded by ribbons and half-empty plates. Lily was still buzzing with energy, her little legs swinging from the couch. Then she turned to her parents with sudden, earnest curiosity. "Are you two getting married again?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Small, but with ripples that reached everything. Grace blinked. "What makes you ask that? Sweetheart?" Lily shrugged, twirling her necklace. "Well, I have friends at school they live with both their mommy and daddy, and I like it when we're all together. It feels like we should be." You know, Ethan's breath caught. Grace's hands went still on the tablecloth she'd been folding. He glanced at Grace, their eyes meeting across the small space between them. So many conversations unfinished, unspoken, hung in that silence. Ethan turned back to Lily, his voice gentle. "That's a really good question. Honey, the truth is, Mommy and I, we're figuring things out." "Like a puzzle?" Lily asked. He smiled faintly. "Exactly like a puzzle." Lily looked between them, sensing the grown-up weight in the air, then nodded seriously. "Okay, but I hope you do." With that, she hopped off the couch and headed toward her room, announcing over her shoulder, "I'm going to put my new necklace with my bunny so I don't lose it." When her footsteps faded down the hall, the quiet that followed was thick enough to touch. Grace sat back, exhaling. "Kids," she murmured, half laughing, half aching. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "She's not wrong?" Grace looked at him, her heart thudding softly. "Ethan?" He turned toward her, his expression open, unguarded. "I know this isn't what you planned or what you trust yet, but when she asked that question, every part of me wanted to say yes." Grace looked away, her throat tightening. "It's not that simple, I know," he said quickly, "but maybe it doesn't have to be complicated either." He stood and paced once, then stopped in front of her, rubbing the back of his neck like a man fumbling for courage. "I've spent most of my life building walls between work and home, success and love. You spent years surviving inside the silence those walls made, and somehow, we're both still here, still standing." Grace's eyes glistened. "And what are you saying?" "Ethan!" He dropped to one knee before her. No ring, no audience, just the two of them, and the faint hum of Lily humming in the next room. "I'm saying I don't want to build walls anymore," he said quietly. "I don't want to spend another day proving things to the world while forgetting the people who are my world." Grace's lips parted, but no words came. "I know what I lost," he continued, his voice trembling, "and I know I don't deserve another chance. But if you're willing to take a leap, even a small one, I'll spend the rest of my life showing you that I've changed, that I've learned what it means to stay." He looked up at her, eyes wet, voice breaking. "Grace Mitchell, will you marry me again?" The air in the room stilled. Grace covered her mouth with one hand. The first time he'd proposed, it had been in a crowded restaurant, a diamond ring glittering under candlelight, a performance of perfection. This time, there was no grandeur, just raw honesty, the kind that trembles when spoken aloud. She studied him, the man who had once been a stranger wrapped in ambition, now kneeling on her living room rug, hands unsteady, but eyes certain. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I am too," he said softly. "But maybe that's how we know it's real." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "Ethan." He waited, silent, holding her gaze with the patience of a man who had finally learned how to listen. Then, slowly, she nodded. Yes, the word was barely audible, but it filled the room like music. Ethan exhaled shakily, laughter breaking through his tears. He stood, and she rose to meet him. He cupped her face gently, their foreheads touching, breath mingling, not a kiss yet, just a promise held between them. "Are you sure?" he whispered. Grace smiled through her tears. "For the first time in years." "I am—" A small voice from the hallway interrupted them. "Mommy, Daddy." They turned. Lily stood there, sleepy-eyed, clutching her necklace. "Did I hear you say yes?" Grace laughed softly, brushing her cheeks. "You did, sweetheart." Lily's face lit up. "Does that mean we're all going to live together? Now?" Ethan chuckled, pulling her into his arms. "We're going to figure that out together." "Okay," Lily nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "Best birthday ever," she murmured. Grace leaned into them, her hand finding Ethan's. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the apple tree, scattering petals across the yard like confetti. Inside, 3 hearts once broken, once distant, beat together again, not in perfection, but in the quiet, beautiful rhythm of beginning anew. The house sat on a quiet hill just outside Ashbrook, framed by rows of maple trees that caught the afternoon light like fire. It wasn't large or grand, not the kind of home that made magazine covers, but it was theirs. Grace stood on the front porch, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she watched Ethan and Lily wrestle with a stubborn garden hose. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and laughter, that rare, effortless kind, drifted across the yard. "Turn it, just a little," Lily shouted. "I am turning it," Ethan called back, struggling with the nozzle. Water sputtered once, then sprayed wildly, soaking them both. Lily shrieked with delight, while Ethan doubled over laughing. Grace couldn't help it. She laughed too, a sound that felt like sunlight breaking through years of storm. It had been 2 months since they'd moved into the new house, 2 months since Grace had said yes, and Ethan had packed up his sleek Portland penthouse to start over in a small town. He'd sold the luxury furniture, the glass dining table, even the art he once bought to fill silence. In its place, they built something new: mismatched chairs, handmade shelves, walls painted in warm earth tones that smelled faintly of pine and new beginnings. The living room window framed a view of the apple orchard down the hill. On cool evenings, Grace would light candles on the windowsill while Ethan read to Lily on the couch. Some nights she would watch them quietly from the kitchen, heart swelling with the quiet miracle of it all, the sight of her daughter's head resting against her father's shoulder. Both of them lost in a story. The house was always full of stories now. On a Saturday morning in late spring, they began planting flowers along the fence, Grace's idea. "Something that grows with us," she'd said. Ethan knelt in the dirt beside her, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in soil. He looked up and grinned. "You know, 6 years ago, I would have hired a landscaper for this." Grace smirked, pressing a seedling into the earth. "6 years ago, you didn't know the difference between lavender and a weed." "Still don't," he admitted, laughing. Lily, wearing overalls and a sun hat far too big for her, clutched a small trowel. "I'm planting daisies," she announced, "because they look happy." Ethan nodded solemnly. "Best reason I've heard." They worked until the afternoon. Heat gave way to the first cool breeze of evening. The flower beds were uneven, some rows slightly crooked, but to Grace's eyes, it was perfect. As they stood back to admire their work, Ethan slipped his arm around her waist. "You know," he said quietly, "this is the first time I've ever built something with my hands that wasn't a company." Grace leaned against him. "It suits you better." He kissed the top of her head. "So does this life." She looked up at him, her smile soft but steady. "We earned it." That evening, they ate dinner on the porch: grilled chicken, fresh salad, and a pitcher of lemonade. Lily insisted on stirring herself. Fireflies began to appear over the yard, blinking softly in the twilight. Lily clambered into Ethan's lap, holding her plate with both hands. "Do you think the flowers will bloom by my next birthday?" Ethan nodded. "If we take care of them?" Grace smiled. "And if we keep the deer away?" Lily giggled. "Daddy can scare them off." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Me? Why not you?" "Because you're bigger," she said, matter-of-factly, "and braver." Grace met his eyes over Lily's head, and they shared a smile that said everything about the man he used to be, and the one sitting here now. When dinner was done and the stars began to gather, Ethan lit the porch lanterns. The light fell in warm pools across the floorboards, flickering like promises. Grace brought out a blanket, and the three of them curled up together, Lily between them, wrapped in sleepy contentment. "Story time," Ethan asked. Lily nodded drowsily. "One about love." He looked at Grace, then back at their daughter. "All right," he said softly. Once upon a time, there were two people who forgot what love was. They thought it meant big things like money and success. But love isn't about big things. Grace tilted her head. "What is it about?" Then Ethan smiled, glancing between them. "It's about small things, about showing up, about saying, 'I'm here,' even when it's hard." Lily's eyes were already drifting closed. "That's a good story," she murmured. Grace brushed a hand over her daughter's hair. "It's a true one," she whispered. Later that night, after Lily was tucked into bed, Grace and Ethan stood together on the back porch. The sky stretched wide and dark above them, peppered with stars. "I used to think home was a place you reached after success," Ethan said quietly. "Now I think it's something you build moment by moment." Grace nodded, her hand finding his. "And something you choose, again and again." He turned toward her, brushing a thumb across her cheek. "Love isn't perfect," he said. "It's choosing each other, even after you've seen every reason not to." Her eyes shimmered in the lantern light. "Especially then." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other as the night deepened, the air cool, the world quiet, the hum of crickets rising like a lullaby. Inside, the clock chimed softly. Then a small voice called from upstairs, "Mommy, Daddy, come tuck me in." Grace smiled, her heart swelling. Ethan's hand tightened gently around hers. "Coming, sweetheart," they called together. They walked inside, the door closing softly behind them. The house glowed with lamplight, warm, lived in, alive. Upstairs, Lily waited in her bed, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. They each kissed her forehead, whispered "I love you," and turned off the light. In the darkness, the stars shone through the window, scattering across the walls like tiny promises. And as Grace and Ethan stood in the doorway, watching their daughter drift to sleep, they knew that this, not the empire, not the success, not the past, was what they had been searching for all along. A home built on forgiveness, a life made of second chances, a love reborn, imperfect and true. Outside, the porch lantern flickered once more, casting a soft glow against the night, a beacon of everything they had lost, and everything they'd found again. Life rarely unfolds the way we imagine. Sometimes, love breaks under the weight of silence, pride, and time, and sometimes, it returns to us in the most unexpected ways. Grace and Ethan's story reminds us that even after deep hurt, it is never too late to begin again. Forgiveness is not forgetting what happened. It's choosing to see the person beyond their mistakes. True love is not built on perfection or promises, but on the courage to keep showing up, to keep choosing each other, again and again, even when it's hard. For many of us, life's second chances come quietly. A phone call we've been avoiding, a knock at the door, a moment to say "I'm sorry." And when they do, we must be brave enough to open our hearts not to erase the past, but to heal from it. In the end, happiness isn't found in grand gestures or perfect plans. It's found in the small, ordinary moments, planting flowers together, reading bedtime stories, sharing laughter after years of silence. Because love, at its truest, isn't about never falling apart. It's about finding the strength and the grace to come home again. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of love, forgiveness, or the power of second chances, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing real, heartfelt stories that speak to the soul and remind us that it's never too late to heal, to forgive, and to love again. Stay with us for more stories that shine light into life's quiet corners. Until next time, keep believing in love's second chances.